Once every year, Scoutmaster Tim Riggs leads a troop of boys into the Canadian wilderness for a weekend camping trip. A tradition as comforting and reliable as a good ghost story around a roaring bonfire. The boys are a tight-knit crew. There's Kent, one of the most popular kids in school. Ephraim and Max are also well-liked and easygoing. Then there's Newt the nerd, and Shelley the odd duck. For the most part, they all get along and are happy to be there, which makes Scoutmaster Tim's job a little easier. But for some reason, he can't shake the feeling that something strange is in the air this year. Something waiting in the darkness. Something wicked. It comes to them in the night, an unexpected intruder stumbling upon their campsite like a wild animal. He is shockingly thin, disturbingly pale, and voraciously hungry. A man in unspeakable torment who exposes Tim and the boys to something far more frightening than any ghost story. Within his body is a bioengineered nightmare, a horror that spreads faster than fear. One by one, the boys will do things no person could imagine. And so it begins. An agonizing weekend in the wilderness. A harrowing struggle for survival. No possible escape from the elements, the infected, or each other.
Hi, I'm Ben and welcome to my review corner. Today I'm reviewing The Troop, a book that was first published in 2014 by Gallery Books and was written by Craig Davidson under the pen name of Nick Cutter. I just want to do a big shout out to Noah at In Between the Lines for not only recommending this book to me but also for lending it me. I will include a link somewhere to his review for that. This review will comprise of 5 main areas. The first one is the basic story. This will be followed by world building, followed by characterization, writing style, and the last section is a bit more amorphous, and that is, do I think you should read this book? So with all that out of the way, let's just get right in. So, starting off with story. The concept of this story is actually not particularly original and is in fact something that you see quite often in a lot of fiction and horror in particular. You have a barely equipped group of people in a relatively isolated location who then have to deal with a threat that they don't understand and don't appreciate the dangers of initially, and then they face a race against time to be able to get away from the area and get to safety before they succumb to the threat. None of that is to say that this is bad. It takes the basic framework that you see in a lot of horror films and it uses it very, 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 very well. The threat escalates sensibly and evolves naturally and makes complete sense. The way that the characters react also makes sense. There are a couple of surprises in here, but I personally called all but one of them. And on a side note, the book goes out of its way to spoil itself at times, even so far as in the synopsis mentioning that this is bioengineered, something that could have been an early reveal in the actual story rather than on the blurb on the back. I would say that overall this is a well-told story in terms of using the established tropes, but at no point does it really exceed what I would class as the basic established genre framework. I give this 2 out of 4, which is a half star. So on to world building next, and this is quite interesting actually. So the decision was made to not go into too much detail on normal life. There are a series of flashbacks for all the main characters, however it is assumed that people are familiar enough with how modern Western society operates, and in a book of this length I think that this was a good call. The flashbacks help to establish character as well as the world, and it very, 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 very strongly leads to the conclusion that the town of North Point, where they all come from, is very much a quiet suburban town where nothing interesting ever happens. Nothing ever. One of those towns that's not disconnected from the world exactly, but yeah, nothing groundbreaking ever occurs there. Where this book really, really, really does shine is how it describes the way the environments on the island change in terms of mood, weather, the effects of the bioengineered threat, and how that alters. And it actually does some really, really good foreshadowing of things that come later on, which is really, really subtle and are not necessarily easy to pick up at the time. The final way that this book deals with world building is through a series of in-universe articles. So things like newspaper reports, interviews, court papers. A lot of these are set after the fact, so it's very much a case of looking back at what's happened. But what's really, really, really interesting about this is how much it looks at the effect that the events at Falstaff Island have on the people involved and the families, and actually the small sleepy community, and also touches on the world at large as well. This is a major incident in a small town, or just outside a small town, and it covers that really, really well. For me, this is one of the strongest aspects of the book. It doesn't go into a stupid amount of detail, it doesn't need to. What it does here is very, very, very good, and it does help feel like the world's lived in and there's consequences to this story. I give this 3/4 of a star, which is a 3 out of 4. And now we reach characterization. This area is a real mixed bag. Nothing here is bad. Everything makes sense. The way the characters act makes sense. The way they are described is well done. The reactions of each scout follow a believable cause and effect. All completely sensible. The story is told from the point of view, largely, of the 5 main characters, from a first-person perspective. Each character does get screen time. They all get flashbacks. And with one exception, who I will not name, you want to see them survive the ordeal, and they do build a level of sympathy. However, most of these characters are not especially likable. I would say out of the group, Max, maybe, and Newt are likable. I really like Ephraim, but I think a lot of people would have issues. And Kent is very much the stereotypical jock type character. Oh look, I'm big and strong and I should be in charge. Shelley, I will say outright, is one of the most dislikable characters I have ever read in fiction. Period. End of. He was well written. I didn't enjoy reading him. And to me, his part in that group he shouldn't have been there. There are different characters that you could, or character types you could put in that situation that would have fitted better and made more sense. He does feel a bit like a plot point after a certain point in the story, and he's there for that rather than for any natural progression on his part as a character. The other thing that this book has an issue with is because it's juggling so many plates in terms of characters, it's 368 pages long. So whilst the characterization you do get is good, and it is very, very, very good, it's shallow, it's surface level, it doesn't really push much beyond that for any of the characters, which is a shame, because overall the character dynamics were one of the best bits of this book for me. But I wanted to see more, and I think this is a case where either telling a story from less of the characters' point of views rather than all of them, or having an extended runtime for the book would have been better and would have actually made a more compelling, interesting and affecting story. Again, none of it's bad. It just feels like there's too many plates being spun at once. I give this 2 out of 4, which is a half star. So I'm going to split this into a couple of different areas. The first one is the pure writing style. So in terms of pure writing, this book is really well written. It follows its well-established arc well, and it hits all its key points. It's well paced, there's a natural evolution to the story, and to the level of threat and to the level of horror that we see, and the way that the group is portrayed falling apart is really, really good. The book is structurally split into 3 sections named The Hungry Man, Infection and Contagion, and these do effectively bookmark the 3 main threat levels throughout the story. Also, I need to give special praise to the descriptive work of the body horror aspects. This is a body horror. It nailed the body horror aspects really, really well. The level of detail was really, really good. The way that future changes were foreshadowed very gently, which I didn't pick up on at the time, but when we reached later on, especially sort of the final form of the threat, so to speak, yeah, it was really, really good, and it had a decent payoff. The external articles are all well written. There's not too many of them so as to be jarring to the story that's being told. Whether you like them or not will be down to personal taste. For me, I could take them or leave them personally, but they were good and they didn't hurt the story and the pacing. Also, the flashbacks for all the characters gave solid build to their characters and helped explain why they were acting as they were. Again, I would have liked to have seen more of this. I still feel that the weakest aspect of this book by far is how shallow the characters are, despite how well written they also are. All that being said, I have some major issues with the overall structure of this book, and I actually feel that the way this book is structured in some places actually damages the flow of the story. Not the pacing rattles along quite nicely, as you'd expect from a relatively short book. However, because you're focusing on so many characters, which I've already mentioned, there is a lot of bouncing around in the story, which spreads them all out too thin, and the lack of character depth, whilst it doesn't hurt the story per se, if there was more focus on the characters, some of the events that happen would carry far more of an emotional gut punch than they had. Although, as I said, this is primarily a body horror rather than a psychological or a suspenseful horror, and it does hit the body horror side of it perfectly. The other issue I have with this book is at 368 pages, it is a total of 50 chapters, so the average chapter is 7 pages long. Even though when you take out the number of articles, pages that are taken up, this is especially jarring when you have some chapters that are less than 2 pages long. And in fact, this helps make the book feel rushed at times. In fact, where this book is at its best is actually when it is in the longer chapters, where it's dwelling on the character, the environment, the consequences and the stakes. Whereas if it's just bouncing a couple of times to a couple of pages, you find yourself in a situation where you're zooming around between the worlds and it can actually end up with you to a point losing the thread a little bit. And it stops you building up those connections with the characters. I get what the intent was, so that you could see the horror from everyone's point of view, but for me at least, I actually found this bouncing around to be really, really detrimental to the story being told and the overall structure of the book. Because of that, I can only give this a 2 out of 4 half. So, when all's said and done, what are my final thoughts on this book? Full disclosure, horror is not a genre I read particularly often, and it is far from my favourite. I like horror aspects in other genres, especially sci-fi and fantasy, but horror on its own, I do struggle with. And body horror in particular, I'm not a massive fan of, so this isn't really a book for me. And I actually found this a difficult book to finish. That being said, that was largely down to the way the book was structured and not the actual writing on display. If you can get past the structural issues, there is a decently written book here. The characterization is good, but shallow, and that is the biggest detriment as well to this story that's being told here. However, it does go all in on the body horror aspects. It does those extremely well. I cannot praise how well they were done enough. And at the end of the day, this is a body horror book first and foremost, and it lands those beats perfectly. Will I read it again? No. Would I read a sequel? Maybe. I believe the film rights have also been sold. I would be interested in seeing that film if it was ever to come to light. Do I recommend the book? If you're a fan of horror, yeah, check it out. If you're a fan of body horror, then I think this is probably a must-read for you. The caveat I will give is that obviously with this being body horror, some of the things that are depicted here are pretty gruesome, as you would expect, so make sure you're going in reading this book with your eyes open to that aspect of it. Because of how well I think horror readers in particular will like this, I'm going to bump up the score slightly. So my overall score for The Troop by Nick Cutter is a 3 stars out of 5 overall. I hope you enjoyed this video. I'd love to know what you think. Let me know down below. And all of you stay safe out there. Bye.